Okay, Anna, thanks for meeting with me again. Um, how's your day been going?
It's been pretty good. Pretty good. Can't complain. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm doing well. Thank you for asking. Um, how's things been with your client and your caseload recently?
Um, yeah, I mean, I guess things have been going pretty smoothly. I've been meeting with Keith for about, I guess, 4 weeks now. Um, and yeah, things are going pretty well. We've been working through a lot of things that he's experienced with his relationship with his dad. Um, he kind of opened up about that to me most recently, um, saying that he has sort of a strange relationship with his dad and one that where he fears his dad and is often looking to try and please his dad, and feeling like he falls short in trying to please his dad. So, um, letting me know that that's where a lot of his, I guess, sadness has been coming from
Hmm.
lately.
Hmm. That sounds pretty observant for him to make that kind of connection to, like an important relationship he has and to like some of these consistent emotions that he's been feeling.
hmm Yeah, yeah, I thought he was pretty insightful as far as that goes, but um, he basically said that he didn't really have any other source of sadness. However, I don't think that is the truth.
Mhm.
Um, he That just so happens to be one that I was able to, I feel like, lead him to,
Mhm.
by asking about his relationships with his siblings and his mother and then his dad. Um, I think some of the questions I asked led him to, be more open about that part of that, m- little ting in his relationship
Mhm.
with dad.
Mhm. And so it sounds like he maybe indicated when you asked about any other issues going on that would be contributing to that sadness and that depression, that he said no, but you maybe had an indication that there was more going on, and maybe that's all he was willing to, admit at the time.
Right. Yeah. So he does pretty poorly in school. As of lately, he's had a lot of D's and F's. Um, that's actually why he came for assessment, was for those grades. But then we, of course, found the anxiety and depression. But I think that plays a major role in it, because he feels like he does lesser than his peers as well. He feels like he's not as good, or doesn't get the grades or has to work, way harder than his peers do. Um,
Yeah.
and he hasn't talked about that as being part of his sadness, but I could see that being
Hmm.
part of it.
Hmm. And so what was your reaction when he told you that that was his only source of sadness? What did you say?
Um, I basically let him down to like, or let him around to let him know that or asked if maybe that was the only thing that he was recognizing right now, and that could it have possibly been um, something else or going on, um, that maybe he wasn't recognizing or wasn't aware of, and he agreed to that. However, he still didn't have any better ideas of what it might be,
Hmm.
that was contributing.
Yeah. And it sounds like you were kind of noticing that discrepancy and maybe saying, "Hey, you reported these things to me earlier that might have been stressors, and now you're saying it's really only this relationship with your dad." And kind of maybe
Mhm.
note pointing out that discrepancy, saying, "Hey, I wonder if this is relevant too." And it sounded like maybe he, was agreeable to that and could see, what you noticed. And
Mhm.
like you were saying, where he didn't notice, like he was maybe able to notice that there was something else but not listed out. I think that's okay. Sometimes I think we need to more like kind of plant seeds, right? And we don't necessarily need to uncover everything at once, but maybe get him to start thinking about that connection and maybe start to build that insight little by little. And so, yeah, it sounds like you were just kind of following him and, um, pointing out that discrepancy, but maybe also kind of letting him go where he wanted to go a little bit. And yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I've kind of been letting him lead on where he wants to go or what he wants to talk about or do in session. However, I've just been digging a little deeper because I spoke with his school, his counselor, and teachers, and they had some other concerns about him as well.
Mhm.
Like they were concerned about his eating, thinking that he wasn't getting enough to eat at home.
Okay.
Um, and they were also concerned about like the parental involvement because they felt like they didn't get a lot of feedback from mom when they send home certain um, reports or certain things happen at school. They just don't really get the concern that they think should come from some of the things that they report, like his grades, um, like his like him viewing or looking like he's malnourished, um, those sorts of things. So they've been concerned with what's happening with him at home as well,
Okay.
and that's been kind of difficult um, to bring up or to work with because it's not something that he brought up or that his family brought up, but it's something that the school brought up. Um, so that's been kind of difficult for me to work around because I don't, it feels as though I'm like placing, adding something additional to this person without knowing for sure if that's something he's experiencing or not.
Hmm. Yeah, it sounds like maybe you feel like you're m- possibly making an assumption about something,
Mhm.
and maybe if you go down that path that it'll be, and I think it's a valid point, filing a CPS report and doing all of that. If you file a report and nothing's going on, that's fine, and no real harm is done through that process. But it is also something that could really affect the therapeutic relationship, and maybe it sounds like you're concerned about kind of what that would entail if you did something as involved as investigating into whether there was some kind of neglect or abuse going on, or even going to that official process of filing like the report.
Right.
Mm, okay.
Yes. So
So
yeah,
I'm
that's been difficult.
go ahead.
No, I was just saying, yeah, that's been the hardest part of it is
Mhm.
just, you know, realize or assessing when it's time to report something or when it is just an accusation
Mhm.
or yeah.
Mhm. Well, it sounded like you had talked with some people. I mean, if we were to go down this route of saying that we maybe need to investigate a little more before we took some kind of definitive action, um,
Mhm.
does anything specifically come to mind for you of like someone you could contact, or like someone you could consult with and maybe get some more answers, or maybe even some way to bring it up in session? I mean, I'm just curious what comes to mind for you, because it sounds like to you that you want to do a little more digging before we make any kind of, take any firm action on what we do or don't do.
Mhm. Yeah, it just seems to me like some of the way that the client answers are maybe trying to cover up something or not let on something. Um, so like when I try to get more information from him, it's as though I have to take it with a grain of salt because I'm not sure if he's being truthful or if he's covering. Um, so then I consider bringing it to supervision, to you, and assessing with you if it's something that I need to, I guess, report. Um, and then again, reaching out to those people at the school that I got the information from and just assessing whether or not um, they've noticed any difference, if there's been something done, because they were at first talking about doing some sort of like meal plan for him, like a reduced lunch meal plan. So seeing if anything further has happened with that. Um, and then also just, seeing if his in person or in class self has changed at all, if he's appearing less hungry, I guess acting less hungry. They say that he's, often ravenous. And then, I guess if those things continue, then figure out the next necessary steps to report it to
Yeah.
DCFS.
Yeah. So why don't we go back a second and start with one of the first things you were talking about, which was to bring it up in session, maybe ask him a few more questions. So it sounded like you're concerned with when you have asked some kind of questions that it sounds like maybe he's not been as open with discussing that, or that you maybe feel that he's kind of being selective with what information he gives you and what he reveals. I'm curious, if we're thinking in the interest of problem solving for this scenario, right? Kind of making, maybe making him feel more open or more likely to talk about it. What comes to mind for you of some, is there something that has come to mind for you of noticed maybe a way that you're asking, or you know, have you noticed maybe that there's some kind of pattern as far as like, how comfortable he feels in therapy? I guess I'm just wondering what comes to mind for you if we're thinking of that first solution of trying to get him a little more open when we ask those questions.
Um, I know I kind of noticed that when he um, is, I guess kind of put on a level playing field, or like when he's reassured that he isn't the only one feeling this way, or he isn't the only one who experiences certain things. I feel like he's more open um, to communicating. I also noticed that when mom isn't home or when mom isn't around, he's more open to communicating. Um, like when I did his assessment, his first assessment, I noticed him kept looking up over the computer screen when I was asking certain questions. Um, but then certain times he will go outside, and then I'll know that he's alone and that he answers questions a bit differently, or a bit more open when it's that way. And also, I think it's just a matter of how, I guess, how deep we get that day. I don't know if that makes any sense, but like, um, if I'm able to, like, one day we were talking about him being expelled in the second grade, and I was able to dig, deeper into that, and then kind of play into school now and how he experiences school now. And he opened up a lot more about that when I let him know that, people do have these turnarounds, these behavioral changes, whereas, you recognizing that the way you behaved in the second grade is not how you want to behave now is a huge step. Um, and also just noting that everything that we're doing in these sessions is to be more helpful to him, to help him. And so I think when he's reminded of that, he's also a lot more open.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. It sounds like maybe that idea of having some kind of comfort or support, right? Maybe kind of like a hopeful sense of a prognosis saying, hey, like a lot of people experience anxiety and depression and have these behavioral maladaptive behaviors, and they turn them around. Like you notice that, hey, in second grade, oh, I was acting like this. And then later on, I noticed these changes, and now I can see the way I've made differences in maybe the way that I think or the way I'm feeling or the way that I'm acting. And kind of tied to that, it sounds like what's helpful for him is, maybe having some more statements about normalizing his experience. And, if we think about in context of this possible neglect or abuse, you know, maybe it sounds like maybe being able to incorporate some statements that are just kind of reassuring and explaining that, things like unfortunately neglect and abuse are not uncommon. And that he's not the first person to, have a complicated relationship with his parents, and that it's normal to be hesitant to talk about it. It sounds like maybe going down that route and kind of normalizing the experience for him and giving him that kind of support would maybe open him up a little more.
Mhm. Yeah, that's what it seems to be thus far.
Mhm.
It's just, I think that he's kind of felt like he might be the only one experiencing the things that he experiences because he's never been able to open up about them. And then he also comes from an African American family where, they're not really big on therapy. And so when I introduced that he would need services, it took several weeks for the parents to even agree to have it done, or agree to begin, because they felt like it was something that he didn't need, especially because dad is typically away on driving trucks and mom is the only one at home. It's always a bunch of relayed information. So it was mom relaying information to dad, and that didn't seem to get it. And so it was eventually when I spoke to dad, that I was able to convince him to allow his child to receive, psychotherapy. So
Mhm.
here
So
we
it sounds
are.
like there's definitely some barriers to him getting into the session at all.
Definitely.
And so maybe part of what we need to think about is, if there are any extra steps that need to be taken with him as far as ensuring that he has a time slot to see you, and that, um, you know, with some of the clients that we have, obviously we have parents who are a little more supportive and are willing to, make sure they keep up with their times and that they're showing up, and that they, have some support when talking about like maybe rescheduling or if they can't meet or things like that. And it sounds like in this case he's not getting that support, which can make it difficult, when they're a child and they don't have the wherewithal to schedule appointment for themselves, or if y'all eventually start meeting in person again, right? Like not just
Mhm.
meeting over the computer, and like getting himself to and from the office. And so it might be something to consider about like what kind of extra steps you may need to take to ensure he's getting services. Of course, while maintaining proper boundaries and making sure that we're not kind of going beyond what our professional responsibilities are to make sure someone's getting those services.
Mhm. Yeah, and that's been, I think, the most struggle about it. But he's at the age where he still has some sort of, I guess, a little bit of way in to get, set himself up for appointments. However, he doesn't have that parental unit saying, okay, you have therapy today, you must make it. So we have had several missed appointments. But I also had, like, just trying to get the final, dissemination out with mom was hard to do. I had to reschedule that several times. So I didn't find it odd to have to do the same thing with him. Um, so I do think that because he's a little bit older, he's able to keep better track of his appointments, and sometimes will show up without the aid of his parents.
Okay.
But I think that, a lot of the missed appointments or late appointments are due to the fact that he doesn't really have a parent who's reminding him, or emphasizing the importance of it. Um, so he's kind of just coming. I call it laissez-faire, kind of just as it happens. He kind of lets it roll. So, um, Yeah, I definitely don't think it's like on his top priority. I don't think meeting for therapy is one of his main things. Um, kind of something that he just has to do or that he's forced to do.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, I do get that sense a little bit for sure.
And it sounds like you get that sense, like from him in the sessions, that he's not necessarily that enthused to be there, or if it was up to him, he wouldn't be talking.
Right.
Okay.
Um, yeah, it feels like that. Like um, he wouldn't be talking if it were up to him. However, when we do get into session and we get into that conversation, you can tell that he enjoys it. I think it almost feels as though he doesn't really have anyone to share with or share on this level with. So you can kind of tell it's almost cathartic for him. So um,
Hmm.
it's
Interesting.
not yeah.
Like that he kind of opens up after a while, and it's like maybe you enjoy this more than you think. I wonder.
Exactly.
I guess I wonder two things. One, I wonder if you feel that you and him are at the point in, I guess, your therapeutic relationship where you feel that you could maybe bring that up some way, and
Um,
kind of, notice like, hey, it's like sometimes, I know like you when we started that maybe you didn't seem as enthused to be here, and that like, sometimes it seems like you don't have a lot to talk about, but like when we get in the rhythm, it's you actually have a lot to talk about, and it seems like you actually enjoy your time being here, and that you have a lot to say that maybe you don't have the I I guess I wonder, in all that good stuff you just told me about the relationship. I guess first I wonder how would if you kind of brought that up, um, how do you think that he would react?
um, I think initially he would kind of, I think, try to stop me from recognizing that. I think he would deny it
Hmm.
at first. Um, I think I would like almost have to shape it in a way that, um, so maybe break it up into pieces and parts until we finally got to the point where he's like, okay,
Mhm.
now I see, where you're coming from, or that it could be helpful.
Hmm.
Um,
So in that interest, because I think that's a good point, and sometimes kind of like what we were talking about with, like, they don't always have to get everything at once, right? And we don't always have to kind of give them a lot. And a lot of
mhm,
part of that insight can be about, them, like giving them a little piece of something and letting them kind of think about it and explore it themselves rather than us kind of volunteering it for them.
mhm,
And so I guess in that interest where you're talking about how it's like it might be a lot at once and maybe give them a little snippet, I guess I wonder like does anything come to mind for you of like maybe like a very light way you could introduce that, or some kind of very open-ended short way you could kind of bring up like, I wonder what that's about. Like, I guess I wonder what comes to mind for you when we're talking about like breaking it down a little bit and giving him like, maybe a little bit at a time instead of bringing up like, hey, like unloading all of this at once, like kind of giving him a little bit to think
mhm,
about and see how he reacts. What comes to
mhm.
mind for you if you're thinking of like that little bit, kind of that foot in the water of how we'd introduce that to him? The idea that yeah. What do you think?
Mm, yeah, that's a good question. Um, I think I could like ask something along the lines of, um, I don't know, maybe like I would focus probably more on school before I try to get at family, just because that's something that um, really kind of doesn't only involve him, but mostly involves only him.
Hmm.
Um, and I think to get him to open up about um, the things that are happening at school and why he's not doing well. And I think that that might lead to home life and how he, doesn't really have the help at home, um, as far as academics go. And, he has older siblings that don't really help either. And then I think that because he has so many siblings, that's also opening up a can of worms too, because I'm sure there's a different relationship in each one of those siblings. So
Mhm.
you're dealing with 7 different relationships or within the system. Um, so I can imagine where some might be easier to talk about than others, and some might be easier to process than others. Some might be more traumatic, or so those sorts of things. I think just getting at um, I think maybe starting like thinking of it as stepping stones and starting at the places that seem more pleasant for him, and having him open up in ways that are, easier. So back to your question about what open-ended questions I would ask him. Um, I'm not really sure.
Hmm.
Um,
And it sounds like maybe you're kind of still figuring out, like it sounds like we're kind of rethinking like where a good entry point would be to start giving him a space to open up. That maybe talk it sounds like maybe for you that talking about the relationship with his mom and the possibility of the neglect and the abuse, that might be a little sensitive, and in like he might not that you might not have the relationship for you to delve quite that deep yet.
mm,
Mhm. And
yeah.
so, you know, while you might not have an answer right now, as far as, because you might not know exactly like, well, do I want to start with school or do I want to start like with his friends, um, I think it is a good point that he might not be ready to talk about that. And, if we think almost in kind of like a CBT kind of way, like exposure kind of way, it sounds
Mhm.
like you're almost thinking of like on a, like a higher, like, a kind of hierarchy, right? Or like exposure
Right.
hierarchy of saying like, well, before we kind of get to this really intense stuff with his mom and this possible neglect, like maybe we need to start on a lower level and kind of establish a baseline of feeling comfortable there.
Right.
um and so, yeah, it might be something to kind of think about, as far as what you're doing, kind of like establishing that, secure relationship, right? I think this is where some like of the other kind of common factors kind of stuff can really come into play, right? Some of the stuff you already talked about of just kind of like opening up for a kind of, a non-judgmental discussion about things. I think, some other common factors, stuff about, just showing consistency,
Mhm.
showing open, empathy and compassion, genuine curiosity, reflective statements. I think, that's kind of with the other common factor stuff that you had mentioned. I think that's a good pathway to kind of be thinking about how can I maybe start establishing some trust on a less intense topic, and maybe getting him feel a little more secure with how, he's able to talk to me and what he's like, feels comfortable enough to reveal.
Mhm.
You know,
Yeah.
but something to consider too is that while while we want to kind of respect where he is as far as his vulnerability and what he's able to open up to, we also want to consider that, neglect and abuse can be a potentially dangerous, um, scenario for him. Right. And so I guess that brings me to that other point we were talking about, of maybe more correspondence with the teachers, right? And the people who indicated that to you. And so I guess I'm curious, what is your relationship like with those teachers? Like, is it just that you've talked on like an offhand, or do you kind of have regular correspondence with them? How often are you like meeting and talking with them exactly?
No, I've only talked with them for the assessment. And then again after we started treatment just once. Um, near the beginning of the treatment, just to kind of like inform them about that we were starting treatment, and again kind of touch base on what are those things that they think that he should improve upon um, in school.
Okay.
So
And to your knowledge, he's meeting with the teachers who you met with and who you talked with, he's meeting with them every day?
yeah, well, one of the people that I talked with is she's called like the lower school something something, but she also serves as a counselor.
Okay.
So she kind of she touches bases with all students in the lower school, but also um, like she gets reports back. So there, she has some students that she sees more regularly, and he happens to be one of them. And so she gets regular reports back from each of his teachers about how he's performing. And that's kind of how the whole food and nutrition thing came up, because
Right.
they were noticing that he's like shoveling his face with food at lunch, and um, not often, or it seems to always be hungry, uh, sort of thing.
Okay. Yeah, and the reason I'm asking is because I think it's worth it, when we're talking about an issue of like safety, um, I think it's worth it for us to be exploring kind of what ways can we keep, investigating this. And, because it sounds like your mind is already kind of in, not obviously confirmed, but is in the direction of maybe, approaching some kind of, like DCFS, or, at least in that arena of like, are we going to have a report? Is there some kind of neglect here? And so I think it is definitely worthwhile to be considering, what those points of contact are for him, like who would have this information if it isn't directly from his mom, because I can understand why that would be difficult to navigate, not only because it sounds like she hasn't been very available to you, um, but also if the incidents are regarding herself, that she might not be as willing to volunteer that information. And so,
Mhm.
you know, I guess something to consider is, what teachers are working with him, and maybe it would be worth it to have another correspondence with them, and, maybe kind of have an open discussion about, these are my concerns that there might be some abuse and neglect, and, maybe start opening that conversation with them to see if, maybe you could start talking about more specific signs that they've noticed, or maybe they can, you can start to, inform them, of keeping a notice for some of these signs that they've already seen, so that way we can start to continue investigating whether this abuse or neglect is going on, and whether we do have to step in as a uh, informed responders. I forgot the name of the term. Mandated reporters. I'm sorry. That making sure that we're following up to our duty on mandated reporters, because if we are, especially if we're, just as that like general reminder of like, DCFS in this state, that as mandated reporters, if you're providing services to a minor, that we do have an obligation to investigate and possibly report if we have any kind of indication that there might be abuse or neglect happening.
Right.
Okay. But when do you meet with him next?
I meet with him on Mondays.
Okay.
So
And you're scheduled to meet this coming Monday.
yes.
Okay. And so, thinking of just a plan kind of moving forward, it sounds like maybe in session we're talking about trying to maybe kind of open up more conversations, possibly about the relationship with mom. And it sounds like maybe if you notice that's kind of still a touchy subject and he's not willing to go there, maybe kind of get him to open up about something a little less emotionally sensitive, like his school or something, like with his friends.
Right.
Okay. And then, so then let's take it to the front on the teachers. What would we what would we think would be a good plan moving forward as far as contacting them and coordinating with them? I can certainly help you talk through that. I just kind of I wanted to check in with you and see if you had any ideas, since you've obviously worked with the school a little bit more and you're a little more familiar with how their procedures
Mhm.
are and how available they are.
Yes, well, so it's almost been Monday will be 5 weeks, and the Monday after that would be 6 weeks. So that would make 6 weeks that we have been meeting. Um, and I think well into time to meet with those teachers. Um, I think my biggest concern is communicating with teachers without letting off too much information. Because I know that I'm not meant to share what we discuss in treatment, and I just don't know how far I should go as far as treatment, period. So if I'm coming to you to to kind of assess more um, about nutrition and, if there's potential abuse, um, how do I do so without giving off too much information? Um, so I don't, because And then another thing I'm concerned with is that they've already let it be known that, the eating or him eating enough was a concern. And so what I will be calling for is to assess, how that has changed and if it has changed. And then if it hasn't changed and they're still viewing him as being, um, not getting enough food or things like that, um, I should then report, because what was reported to me was that he's not receiving enough food, but it just feels weird coming from a third party. And then especially when that third party is also a mandated reporter. So if they're not reporting, should I be reporting? Or are they having the same ideas I'm having? Like we're each expecting the other one to report, or um,
Right. So a couple of things with that. One, I think would be, to consider. Now, I would imagine if you're talking with the teachers that the mom or the parents have signed some kind of like release form for y'all to. And so what I would do is look over that form, and a lot of them, have like multiple check boxes. Very rarely do they leave off any check boxes unless the parents are specific and say they don't want you to talk about certain things with teachers. I would maybe look over those release forms and just, refresh yourself on kind of what the purview of them, the release forms are, just to make sure that you are at liberty to talk about, um, therapy content. And something to consider too is that, if you're kind of in an information gathering process with the teachers, you may be able to ask a lot of those questions without necessarily giving a lot away about how y'all are doing in session, what you specifically talked about. It sounds too like maybe since the teachers were the ones who volunteered the information and have some information about that, that you might kind of be able to just ask them questions. And so it might be kind of less of a breach of confidentiality as far as what y'all are talking about in therapy than we need, or that we expected that we needed. Um,
right.
Another thing to consider, and why I think it's important to, you know, be conferring with these teachers and opening up the idea of like, hey, you told me this information, and just to let like kind of our idea of mandated reporters, it could be a good avenue for you to provide some advocacy for him, in
Mhm.
case the teachers aren't as well versed on the whole process of reporting to DCFS and what their responsibility of mandated reporters are. As teachers, they are mandated reporters and they have to go through some kind of training. So I imagine they're somewhat familiar as well, but it's not necessarily something we can take for granted, since he's a minor and he can't advocate for himself. And so I think you make a good point where it's kind of like, who who's got the ball, who's, who, like whose responsibility is what, who's going to do what when, and like who's going to kind of take up the, what responsibility. And that might be something to talk about with these teachers, that you're consulting with and getting this information from, because something to part of the reason I was asking you earlier about how many times a week they see him is because it might be worth, something to consider is that you see him once a week, right? Or do you see him multiple times a week? You're only seeing him once a
Just
week,
one.
right? Okay, that's what I thought.
Mhm.
Um, that you're seeing him once a week for an hour, and they might be seeing him not only multiple times a week, but maybe multiple times a day, maybe like for multiple classes, depending on what,
Right.
their structure is with how many teachers teach what, subjects and things like that. And so
Mhm.
it might be worth it to talk to them and make note of the fact that they have that while you're kind of gathering information and looking into this with them, that they have more of um the detailed information about what, how
Right.
he's like the things you talked about, that are relevant in a DCFS report, how he's presenting every day, what indications they're getting of the home life, what kind of communication they have from the parents, what they're seeing as far as, his physical appearance and his health. And so something to talk about with them is kind of generally this plan of what are we going to do if we have to report, right? And so that not only includes kind of like who is going to be providing what information, but also who is going to be the person who writes calls in, or or writes up the report. um who's going to be the person who is in contact with DCFS in case they have any questions. um and so I think that's kind of part of the planning with the teachers, is not only getting more information, but kind of game planning. If we do have to report, what is that process going to look like? Because like anything, it's better to kind of know ahead of time what you want to do. So that way in the moment, in case something changes, or, I mean, in case of the possibility that you're kind of stressed while you're doing it, because it's, I mean, it's not a very calming thing to do. Um,
Mhm.
it's worth it to kind of be thinking out a process of like who is going to be taking what responsibility. um it might even be worth it if they're not as familiar with the DCFS reporting to maybe talk with them about what it is, like talk to maybe
Mhm.
pull up the website and show them like, well, here, here's the form and this is what you fill out, or like show them the phone number and kind of walk them through and say they're going to ask you these questions and this question and that kind of stuff. Because again, they are mandated reporters and they should be somewhat familiar, but not everyone is just as up to date on those kind of processes as they should be, or as we are, as our own in our own profession. And so just kind of making sure those gaps are filled, because again, since he's a minor, he can't really advocate for himself in that same way.
Right. Good idea.
Okay. Well, yeah, and so it sounds like you have a pretty good plan as far as um how to approach our sessions with him, maybe looking more into that, and maybe as well as like reaching out to some teachers and seeing if we can investigate this more, and just make sure that we're looking into this in case it is an issue. Okay. Well, we got a few minutes left. Is there anything else going on with your caseload, or any, just kind of administrative wise that you wanted to talk about?
Um, Nothing really. I guess the newest thing is my client Nathan, who I've been seeing for behavioral issues with
Mhm.
school, kind of acting out towards the teachers, was put out of school.
Mhm.
Um, I guess they had finally had enough for him. So, um, when we started treatment, my other supervisor let it be known that he was probably a person who would not benefit from treatment. But we were going to go ahead and try it anyway. And it just seems as though that's what's happening. We have tried everything we can, but not really getting the results that one might hope for. So it seems as though a lot of the issues or the behaviors that we're seeing are from lack of attention from mother and him kind of longing for, attention from his mom, whereas mom is buying him all of these things. All he really wants is some time with mom. Um, so we've kind of come to that realization. But yeah, so now it was kind of defeating because I felt like what we were working towards was trying to get him to become adaptable or able to exist within this Montessori school, and then
Mm.
figuring out that he can't, or at least not this school. It's not meant for him. He can't get along there, whether that be because of his behaviors or I guess the relationships that he's already cracked within that system. So that was kind of like a bludger, I think, for everyone. Mom was kind of fed up with the school already, but Nathan was really upset about it, and I also was kind of upset about it because um, I really felt like the success of his treatment was based on whether or not he was able to stay in school. Um, However, I do think that I've helped him in some ways. So I just try to hold on to that. Um, but yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, it sounds like it's kind of, difficult to deal with because, you're trying techniques that you think will be helpful and probably have been helpful for a lot of other people. Um, and for whatever reason, whether it's, kind of what his disposition is and how he kind of learns, right? And kind of what his preferences in that style, or maybe, kind of the system around him and the fact that now he's not going to have that structure of school, and that might hinder him from getting the benefit of some of the treatments you wanted to try. But I can understand why that would be kind of difficult, and feel like you have some kind of personal ownership of how well he's doing. But I think you have a good point with reflecting on the positive gains you've made. um and it sounds like that even if y'all didn't get quite to the finish line or get all the goals completed, or maybe even if he's regressed in some areas, that you have made progress in some areas. And I think you know knowing the difference, right, between kind of like I've done all I can versus like thinking that we can maybe still work with someone when we're kind of at our limit. I think it's something to consider as far as as a skill of yours as well, as kind of knowing your own competence level and understanding maybe when you are at your limit. And because I mean it happens, it's a reason why it's written into the ethics code, is because like not every therapist is competent for every single patient. And sometimes we do have to refer out, I mean, if it's a behavioral issue and it has to do with that attachment issues with his mom, he might require something a little more specific to, um, attachment related therapy. Or it could, or maybe something like PCIT that we don't necessarily practice here, and so it might be that he just needs something more specific that you can't provide at the moment. Um, but I think it's worth it for you to be thinking about, and just kind of reflect on that skill you have of just noticing that, hey, like I tried what I can and we made some progress, but maybe it's time to move on and get you, you know, in a direction of someone who can help you out better. But we're about a time right there. And so what we'll do is we'll table that and we'll talk more about referring him out. If that's what we want to do, we can talk about that and um,
Mhm.
maybe look up some resources and what that would look like for him.
Cool.
All right, great. Well, it was great meeting with you, Anna, again, and I'll see you next week.
Cool. See you next week.